Toronto. York. Muddy York. The Belfast of Canada. The city of churches. The Good. Hogtown. Big Smoke. The city of homes. The city of neighborhoods. The megacity. The city that works. The most diverse city in the world. The most fascinatingly boring city in the world. T.O. T-Dot. The YYZ. The Six. Toronto has had many monikers throughout its history, each reflecting its ever-changing population, industries, cultures, politics, and infrastructure, along with the myths produced and sustained by each new version of itself. Like the country of which it is sovereign, Canada's Queen City has long been obsessed with its own identity, some pointing to its supposed deficit, others to its surplus. As a city that is constantly changing, Toronto has tempted many of its dwellers to believe that it is new, that it has no history, no baggage, no sins, no victims, only wide-eyed dreams. With the overwhelming majority of its population being immigrants and their direct descendants, ideas about new beginnings and opportunities to refashion oneself are common currency across the over 100 languages spoken in the city. But so is the drive to remember and preserve homeland heritages, languages, and relationships that are time and again rediscovered and reinvented in Toronto. However, Toronto was no blank canvas waiting for new settlers to make their pioneering mark. It's more like the wooden light posts of its streets, riddled with rusty staples and bits of historical posters announcing events past, ripped apart by passers-by. We all live in someone else's land. There are few places where this is truer than in Toronto, where layers upon layers of mental maps, each with their own landmarks, stories, heroes, and villains, are stacked on any given spot. A deck of juxtaposed yet invisible cities, known only to the communities that inhabit them. Invisible also because the rush to build has, in many cases, erased them. "I remember when this place used to be," is a common remark made by Torontonians, whose personal experiences of growing older with this ever-youthful city often miss the physical landmarks in which to index their memories. But they live on, in old photos, films, newspapers, and oral testimonies that hover the debris of lost places, nurtured by archivists and plucked by historians. Many landmarks do remain, especially those built by the immigrants who arrived after the Second World War, including the one that Torontonians are most proud of, themselves in all their diversity. Torontonians are similar in their differences, which they proudly share with one another and with the rest of the world. But this multiculturalist city tends to privilege some forms of solidarity over others, thus missing the many moments in its history where shared struggles and aspirations created lasting bonds across ethnic and linguistic groups, as was the case with the Irish, the Italians, the Portuguese, and the many other immigrant construction workers who built Toronto in the post-war period. Theirs is a history of bravery and foolishness, selfishness and greed, friendship and enmity, triumph and tragedy, driven by the pursuit of individual and collective dreams. This is their story.
if Robarts does not move in on this, he's out of his cotton-picking mind, and he'll be... And he and his party will be responsible for the violence that surely will follow.
We want Robarts! We want Robarts!
They're firing our stewards, threatening to beat up some of the boys, and I know full well that you guys can take care of yourselves. I know you're just as tough, if not a hell of a lot tougher than they are, but I'm afraid that if I just did not stop a job, that some of you might retaliate and belt some of these guys and maybe seriously hurt them. Now, I don't want any man hurt, either in management or labor. And because of that, we stopped the job today.
I have no quarrel with the fact that the Prime Minister and the Premier of the province, Mr. Robarts, and the Mayor and Mr. Allen, the Chairman, are honoured. This is the way it should be. This is what we expect. But just for once, we felt that it would be very nice that if they would remember these people. After all, the families growing up of these men who died would be able to look at a plaque such as this and realize there's more to building a subway than just allocating funds or taxpayers' money, so that they will say, well, my father worked here and he is remembered and honored.
My father was Gerry Gallagher. My father was the founder of the Labourers Union Local 183, which as a modern union has grown to, I heard Jack Olivier at a rally yesterday say they have 60,000 members. He was born in Ireland in a little town called Athlone, which is dead center of Ireland on the River Shannon. He was the youngest child of a family of 13. He had charisma. He had a lot of charisma. He could make you laugh. He loved telling stories. He was quite a storyteller. He was a gifted storyteller. Commonly for us, a Christmas would be spent around my dad regaling us with stories of growing up in Ireland or the war or his work, different things with a humorous twist. He was a very modest man. He had a very self-depreciating humor. He was the first one to laugh at himself and join everybody else in laughing at him. He didn't have, he was very confident, so he didn't really have a big issue with that. He was very, very kind. In our house, you know, the word love was used often and most often by my dad. In all the things that he did in his life, it seemed that he fell into leadership positions. For example, when he did volunteer to join the English Army, despite the fact that he was Irish, which was not necessarily an advantage in the English Army, especially Southern Irish, he was made a sergeant in pretty short order. He went overseas and he was left behind after the Great Retreat to the fall of Dunkirk, and was stationed there guarding a fuel for the tanks and airplanes and all that were in large barrels in France, and he was stationed with a group of men kind of isolated to guard this fuel depot, and became missing in action because they only heard news through shortwave radios. They didn't know that there was a great retreat going on until they saw the Luftwaffe flying overhead with the Iron Crosses on the planes, and they heard German voices on their shortwave radio. And despite the fact they couldn't reach their headquarters for instructions, those men had to make a decision to abandon their position and make sure that the fuel didn't fall into the hands of the Nazis and the German war machine. So they blew it up, and they headed to a port in the south of France because Dunkirk was already blocked. They traveled probably about 300 or 400 miles south to the port of Saint-Nazaire, and he managed to get his men out in a small French port. Even when I heard him talk about his being at the prisoner of war camp as a guard, he didn't hate the Germans, despite all the propaganda and his own experience, where they were literally hunting him and a group of men that were trying to escape for France after the fall of Dunkirk. He didn't have it in him to hate the Germans. He saw them as men just like him that were doing what they were ordered to do. And he was criticized in his role as a prison guard for being a German lover, for being too kind to those German soldiers. He would bring them cigarettes, and he used to tell me that he taught them to sing "You Are My Sunshine," which is a lovely song. He taught them to sing it in English. And he said some of them were just boys that had been captured near the end of the war. So that kindness that he had kind of permeated his attitude, I think, about everything, whether it be religion or politics or what have you. He was averse to hate. He was in England with my mother after the war in London, and he held various jobs. He delivered coal, which was a very hard job. My dad was not that big in stature. He was only 5'8". He used to tell stories about the people letting their dogs out and jumping on top of a big bag of coal and throwing coal at the dog to get the dog away from him. He was in a car wash, washing cars, washing dishes when he first went over there. Just basic labor type of jobs, anything that he could find. They didn't see much prospects, I suppose, for where they were. And originally in London they had kind of embassies set up. They had a Canada house and they had an Australia house, and they were encouraging workers to go overseas. And originally they did all the paperwork to go to Australia. That's where my mother wanted to go originally. And then just the day before they were to go to Australia, she had a change of heart and said that it was too far away from her mother and too far away from her sister. So he went back the next day to a Canada house and found out that they needed workers at Hydro. So he signed up, and away they went. My father came to Canada in about 1951. He came first. My mother stayed home with the two girls, and my dad went over and worked at Burlington Hydro. My father was approached by an organizer. The people that he was in charge of were making less money than other workers doing exactly the same thing further down the station, so he agreed that it was wrong. And he agreed to help the Laborers Union International. And by that time my father had been promoted. He was a foreman. But he also had this sense of fairness. He invited them to a meeting to speak to the workers, which probably would have been frowned upon by the higher ups at Hydro, one would think, but he seemed to get away with it anyways. And they were so successful at organizing those workers that the international rep said to my father that he was too busy to, he had a lot of other parts of Canada and whatnot that he had to visit and organize, and would my father be interested in working for the Laborers Union? And he agreed and received the charter. After they gave the charter, which included all of Ontario, he had a car. He had to travel up into northern Ontario where they were building the lines all through the north and whatnot, and visit remote camps. And so he was very active in organizing the original jurisdiction. So I think that when the jurisdiction was changed by the International, he had to go where the workers were, and the workers were in Toronto, building the subway system.
In 1958, following directives from the Laborers International office in Washington, Gerry Gallagher began organizing sewer and water main, road building, and subway construction workers in metropolitan Toronto, at which point he discovered the appalling working conditions facing tunnelers, propelling him into his lifelong mission to improve work safety standards in Ontario's construction industry.
I think in the beginning, the Irish were very dominant in the tunneling. Later on, when more and more Italian workers came to the city, and they ended up finding themselves not so much in the tunnels, although they did work in the tunnels. A lot of them, I think, worked on the utility and sewer and water main companies and the masonry, home building and that sort of sectors.
My name is Michael Byrne. I grew up in County Kildare, Ireland, in a small village called Castledermot, south of Dublin. Growing up in Ireland was really nice, but there weren't very many opportunities for working class people at that time over there. And of course, emigration was always a thing with Ireland. A lot of sons and daughters emigrated for a better life in the United States or in Canada. And we were no different than anybody else, so we emigrated to Canada too, and to Toronto. My brother picked me up at the airport, and as soon as we got out of the airport and got on the 401, my eyes almost popped right out of my head. I could not believe I had never seen the flyovers on the highway. I've never seen highways so wide. I couldn't believe how fast he was driving. My heart was in my mouth, in and out of traffic. In that particular time, there weren't that many high buildings in Toronto. CN Tower wasn't there. I think the Imperial Bank of Commerce was the first of the bigger buildings in Toronto. Most buildings were 12, 15, 20 stories.
Well, it was a very small city then. Like. Eglinton, there wasn't much north of Eglinton. And when you went to Lawrence, you were out in the country. And the bus stops out to Lawrence, you had to put in a second fare. The 401 was out in the country, 427 likewise. They had built City Hall in '67, so they had an observation tower there. You had to pay money to go up to view the city. So it's come a long way since then. I was 24 when I emigrated, 24, 25. That was a big decision at that time. I did have a brother here that I came out to, which was a big help. The company that my brother was working for asked me to go there. And that was my first construction job. Done a job around Avenue Road and DuPont area. It was a sewer job. Then I went to the subway tunnel, the Yonge Street subway tunnel from Hogs Hollow down to Lawrence Avenue. The subway tunnels were pretty good. Like you had a shield and you had jacks, but in the sewer tunnels, that time you didn't have anything. You just had to brace everything off of the side, and it was a harder job. It was all manual, but in the subway we had a shield. It's the same on the outside now as the tunnel boring machine. On the inside, there was the tables came out that you were standing on. They were jacks, used as jacks as well as tables. Like when you put the timbers on the face, they came out and they held it. And there was 4 jacks up above where you're standing that you'd put onto the ground. But you did it with spade. Now you have the rotary head. First you did the pile driving on each side. And then we had to put in beams from one side to the other and keep Yonge Street open. And yeah, had to put 12 by 12 beams on it, wooden beams to carry the traffic. And that was a challenge.
My name is Rocco Di Giovanni, and I'm 75 years old. I came in Canada September 11, 1960, and I started to work on the house, build the house. But I don't work too long there because money was not there. Work hard, they work 12 hours, 13 hours, and they pay only 8. That time, 90 cents an hour was nothing, you know. And then I told my brother, I say, you know what, I better change because otherwise I want to go back home. But he said to me, okay, you come Queen's Park, you come college and university. Tomorrow, like a day after, you come to there and we see what we can do. So I went there, we went to the Union Hall. There was the Irish guy there, Gerry Gallagher and Mike Relly. And I signed up the day after I went to work on the subway. When you work at the subway, you start to work on the spade, compress, like you spade in the shop the dirt and put on the bogey, and they push them out. They take them out and you load them again, That's what you do underground. But that's the experience. Then I started to work on open cut at the subway. Open cut was different. It was much better, the tunnel. You make more money, but it was very hard. The open cut, it was more safe. Like you see the sun on the open cut. Like you do, you put the beam on each side. You brace, make sure nothing fall down, and you keep going. But the tunnel, you work underground, and you got to work bend down all the time. When you go out, you see the light. It looks like you see something else. It was hard, but I like it because money was there. I said, oh, in a couple of months I'm going to buy a new car, and I buy a car. I was happy. Then I started, when you start to get money.
It was really hard work, but you were getting paid bonus. There were guys working there that were averaging their take-home pay at that particular time with bonus was $500–600 a week, which at that particular time was a fortune because the average on construction might have been $140, $150 take-home. That was a lot of money for a lot of people at that particular time. They were all able to afford homes of their own, and it was a much sought after job at that particular time, to be a miner down there.
Underground we have probably the most changeable grounds in the world here in this city. You can go from clay that's rock hard to sand to nice clay and to just real gummy sticky clay. So they had trouble always with that. Especially when we got near the end, just about 10 foot above the shale. It got really bad. There was like a river bed there, and there was some big large-sized stone in it, and one big rock actually. And there was a piece of a tree that was still there from the Ice Age or whatever. You'd see all the little branches and the tree. And down through the shale, you come through, get all kinds of fossils. The world was upside down one time. The first kilometre or so was good ground, and then we went into wet ground, and we had to stop the project and build locks to put on air pressure on it. And the rest of the job was air pressure.
Compressed air solidifies the face when it's compressed, invisible. It's destroying your lungs and your body and your soul, everything else, but you don't know it because it's like smoking. You don't get any violent reaction of pain or anything. It's a deadly, silent, terrible thing, this air pressure.
Originally, the biggest concern was the Benz disease and that type of thing that underground workers were getting because there was no real testing of the air quality, the pressure underground. Workers would get the same disease that divers would get, when they come up too quick from being in great depths. I mean, when they came up, they would get the same bends, which is bubbles in the blood.
It's serious. You have to be taken and put in a chamber to be decompressed again, and you have to go through the tests and go into the chamber, and it's scary when you're in that for the first time because it's steel and you hear all the air coming in and filling up, and you have to inhale it, or your ears sometimes don't open, then you have to swallow. And if you're on a plane, sometimes you have only a quarter of a pound of air there or less, and the way your ears pop. And Gerry Gallagher in the early years, they were working 12 hours or 10 hours or 9 hours a day under air pressure. And then he changed that. He took it down to, I think, depending on the amount of air you worked under, you could go from spend 3.5 to 4 hours in, and then you had to come out for an hour and a half. Like, that was a big change.
And at that time, nobody knew anything about compressed air. There was 50 pounds of air and there was people going into work on it. Mm-hmm. Nobody understood what it was all about. There was people who got sick coming out of that air, died sometime later, natural causes. This Dr. Gamara come to the Toronto East General Hospital to study to be a surgeon. He was a doctor in Peru. He was told to do some experimenting in regard to caisson disease, but not to go too deep. Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Gamara began to see the type of thing that was there and did go deep. Mm-hmm. Went much too deep for the liking of the medical, the college here of doctors, you see. And as a result, he never was able to pass his exams, even though he wrote them about 5 times. They told him not to give any information to Gallagher or Riley at the union, period. Right. Give them no information. Right. And he said, I can't do anything if I don't have their help. Mm-hmm. Well, they said, don't do anything. Well, this was too important to Gamara for to let go. Right. And as a result, we were in the picture, and we went to the compensation board, and we got all of those things amended, the laws amended, in order to provide today, if a man dies and they can attribute any of the his sickness to the compressed air, yes, he gets a pension. Right. His wife gets a pension after he dies. Mm-hmm. At least there's something done.
Safety back then wasn't a bigger concern as what it is now. You took a lot of chances, you get bad ground, and it was all timbers. You had to timber the face, and if you didn't get them right, it could come in. And when you have a lot of ground overhead, the pressure is unreal. I seen one place in another job that came in, the face came in and it lifted the tracks up 7 feet to the ceiling. And so if you happened to be there, you hadn't any chance.
Those guys were working in insanitary conditions, terrible, dangerous conditions, really dangerous. There was no health and safety. There was no breaks. You got your lunch, but there was no coffee breaks, paid coffee breaks, no nothing like that. Unbelievable bad contractors. There wasn't much emphasis being put on the plight of workers. They were called sand dogs at that time. Those people working in tunnels. That's how much they thought of them.
Gallagher's activism became more urgent after 5 Italian workers died in an underground water main tunnel near York Mills and Yonge Street on March 17, 1960, in what became known as the Hog's Hollow tragedy. On that St. Patrick's Day evening, a fire started in the tunnel's main shaft, caused during the welding of one of the pipe sections. 7 workers were able to escape at the first sign of smoke, while 6 others were left inside, between the flames and a bulkhead. The compressed air prevented the smoke from escaping the tunnel, making it difficult to breathe and to see. The rescue team was left with the difficult decision: clear the smoke by decompressing the tunnel, which would condemn the men to the bends and likely cause it to collapse, or let the fire run its course and hope for it to extinguish quickly. After 30 minutes, the firemen began pouring water through a hole in the side of the tunnel. The rescue team finally decided to open the compression chamber, hoping that the men had made their way there. But between them was the thick smoke, quicksand, knee-high water, and a 36-inch wide steel pipe, where in some sections there was only 18 inches of space to crawl through, in total darkness and scorching heat. After various attempts, the rescuers were able to pull out Walter Andruszuk, a 51-year-old Belgian immigrant and veteran miner. Andruszuk's emergence from the hellhole lifted the spirits of the family members and co-workers of the other men still trapped inside. But their hopes were crushed after rescue attempts returned empty-handed, bearing the news that one of the men lay dead on top of the pipe. The 26-year-old Italian immigrant Pasquale Allegrezza had the same fate as his 4 other countrymen, Guido Mantella, Alessandro Mantella, Giovanni Fusillo, and Giovanni Coriglio. It would take days before their bodies were finally retrieved.
Well, mainly because of safety. It's a well-known fact that our organization has been fighting for safety for a good many years. And in addition to that, our people are killed more than any other organization. We most hazardous work, underground tunnel work and so on. And we asked the companies to recognize our safety clause. They would not. And even though they offered us 35 cents, which doesn't look to be a very bad offer, we feel we must hold out for our principle of saving men's lives rather than accepting a nickel in exchange for their safety.
After that point, my father dedicated the remainder of his career to champion health and safety and getting changes to labor laws, health and safety laws, particularly working underground, and became quite well known for being a maverick, for doing things that he felt needed to be done, whether they were legal or not. Was secondary of importance. He respected the law, but he felt that people need to they need not to obey laws that are unjust. So if a law was not right or was omitted something, he felt that you should agitate for change. I think one of his famous sayings was that when it comes to health and safety, we're in a hurry. His actions prevented a lot of tragedies after the Hogs Hollow disaster. He was way out on a limb. I mean, at the time, there was not a lot of labor laws to protect workers to begin with, which was what he was challenging, but there wasn't a lot of labor laws that protected unions either. So sometimes when he was shutting down these jobs for health and safety reasons, he was doing it illegally. So at one point, he did get arrested and taken to jail, and while he was waiting for charges, the union had a big meeting at Exhibition Place. And they were beginning to get very angry because their leader was in prison. The authorities decided to quickly get him before the judge and then get him released, and then the police drove him. They actually delivered him to the stadium to go and make a speech. And so he arrived, was full. I mean, he arrived and settled the crowd, got the crowd back organized and settled down, and talked about not being repentant for doing what he'd done because he was trying to save lives.
They were always quoting to me the law that I was doing what was illegal, it was wrong, it was stopping work, it was stopping production. It was the only thing that really got the contractors to their senses. They were completely ruthless. They were in a situation of bidding. They were bidding each other into the dust. And they had to sacrifice something. And what they were sacrificing was human life, the lives of our members particularly. And they called our men. One reporter, getting carried away a little bit and describing me, said, and a big headline in the paper, which amused me quite a bit, said, Gallagher's guerrillas, he called them. We'd descend onto a job and stop it, We'd go to the superintendent, look, you've got this unsafe condition here. In a nice way, we want to try to help you. Would you get that fixed before we proceed any further? 70%, 80% of the superintendents would reply, thank you very much, I will get it fixed, with the smart ones. Yeah. And that would be fine. We'd done our job and we went away. The guy was all right. But you get the odd idiot who was worrying about production, what the boss would say to him. And they were in a bit of a press too. So say, no, go to hell. The minute they said something like that, or wouldn't cooperate, Pike or me or whoever would stop the job. Stop it in this fact. I've walked into the subway to a Sandy MacDonald, the superintendent of McAlpines, which is famed in song and story for hiring Irish, and I walked on into his job. On a summer, I complained about water. And I walk in, I said, Sandy, can I speak to you for a minute? So I said, they want water, and they want this and that and the other. Put down the things they wanted. They want washing facilities, they want to go on the buses and so on properly, they want lockers or whatever. They're all fairly small things, see, but the men wanted them, had been asking for them over and over again. I've been told by foremen, it's coming, we're going to put it. Nothing was done. Gerry said, they're all trivialities, that's where you're in trouble. I said, that's precisely why you're in trouble. Trivialities, I said, what men suffering out there and and the conditions they're working under, I said, and you say it's trivialities. A lot of trivialities make a major case of it now. Oh, he said, I suppose you're going to stop the job. No, I said. No, I said. It stopped.
Gallagher was relentless in his campaign to improve work safety standards, earning him the reputation of being unreasonable and excessive in the eyes of contractors, who were equally relentless in launching hundreds of unsuccessful court actions against his many illegal walkouts. Gallagher's eagerness to pull his men from job sites at the slightest safety infringement or affront to their personal dignity was a deliberate nuisance, a direct action tactic that simultaneously removed workers from immediate danger and increased his leverage to bring about industry-wide changes, instead of the piecemeal gains achieved through collective bargaining with individual employers, as was the norm in Canadian labor politics. For a short period of time, Gallagher's activism veered into the field of electoral politics. In 1962, he ran unsuccessfully as an NDP candidate in that year's federal elections, then tried again in 1973 as an independent candidate for the Board of Control of North York. Besides his fellow Irishman Michael Riley, Gallagher was able to count on an equally committed supporting cast of union officials and the over 3,000 members of the Labourers' Local 183. One member in particular was responsible for stopping hundreds of unsafe work sites, including some of the largest construction projects in Canada. Dubbed the Safety Crusader by Toronto's press, Norman Pike was hired as Local 183's safety director in 1964, becoming possibly the first to ever hold such a position in any union in Canada. The towering 24-year-old Newfoundlander was the spearhead in Gallagher's safety campaign, doing unannounced safety inspection blitzes across Ontario. When a contractor failed to comply with his high standards, Pike would pull his union men from the job and call in his sizable group of demonstrators to descend upon the site and shut it down. Many of these activists were disabled workers, like Pike himself, a former tunneler, who had lost his sight in his right eye in a tunnel explosion and damaged an eardrum after being in a compression chamber for too long. Together, they took the fight to Queen's Park, where Gallagher and his men marched numerous times until their voices, amplified by Toronto's press, could no longer be ignored by policymakers.
Being a maverick, my dad used the media quite a bit. He would actually call up the reporters and tell them he was going to shut a job down. So they loved that because that was news. So they could arrive with their camera crews and then he would come along and shut the job down. And that would be on the evening news, and it would increase the amount of pressure on the companies and on the government to bring in safety laws.
Gallagher's activism projected him into the media's spotlight, not only as a frequent newsmaker, but also as a public persona admired by some and detested by others. Such was his notoriety that the CBC's groundbreaking TV drama series Wojak featured a fictional version of him in its pilot episode, first aired in 1966. The show followed Dr. Steve Wojak, a character inspired on the principled and flamboyant city coroner Morton Schulman and his real-life inquiries. The pilot episode, titled "Tell Them the Streets Are Dancing," told the story of an Italian tunneler who died from the bends and of the coroner's investigation into the dangerous working conditions facing immigrants in Toronto's underground construction, leading up to a deadly tunnel collapse, reminiscent of the Hogs Hollow tragedy.
Costa to kill another man in this tunnel. How many funerals you want to go to before you do something? Look, how can I call a strike? You tell me that. We still got a contract, haven't we? A contract to do what? Kill more men?
For Gallagher to become a regular news commentator, there had to be reporters willing to listen. No other journalist listened to or wrote more about Gallagher's advocacy than the Toronto Telegram's Labour reporter and future Progressive Conservative minister in Ontario, Frank Drea, whose stories about the difficult existence of Italian construction workers in the city earned him a major award for social justice journalism.
Frank was the son of an Irish tradesman. His father worked in Montreal, and he seen the same conditions in Montreal. And when he came to Toronto, it was even worse in Toronto, what workers had to go through at that particular time. They could cut their wages, they could do anything they wanted. and there's nobody there to speak up for them. He was already writing articles in the Toronto Telegram about the plight of Italian, Portuguese and Irish workers and what they had to go through. But nobody seemed to be listening too much. They just wanted all this stuff to be hushed and go away, go away. Hog's Hollow was the straw that broke the camel's back. Frank wrote an article about the disaster of Hog's Hollow and what it meant to the families and everything else. And John Bassett called him into his office at that particular time, him thinking he was going to get fired. But he congratulated him and told him, "You keep writing on this issue." Now, John Bassett at that particular time would have had interests with contractors and all and the like of that, and he would have owned pretty well City Hall. He had politicians on his side, a whole lot. For him to take that stand for the workers, you know, he could lose a lot of advertising in the newspapers, but he didn't. And Frank Dre wrote and wrote about it. And I think he's one man that never got thanked enough for health and safety, was that young writer.
At the time of the Hog's Hollow tragedy, the construction industry was regulated by the Building Trades Protection Act, dating back to 1911. The Royal Commission on Industrial Safety, appointed by the Ontario government shortly after that fatal accident, found that the archaic and outmoded act was almost unknown and unenforced across the industry, where even its labor unions were unaware of its existence. After hearing from over 110 stakeholders, including Gerry Gallagher, the commissioners recommended that new legislation be introduced, which would lead up to the Construction Safety Act in 1962. Despite this legislative victory, the accident toll continued to climb, along with its financial costs. According to the Construction Safety Association, in 1972, the total cost of the over 18,000 compensable injuries in Ontario's construction sites was 6 times greater than the net profit for the industry. Worse than that, over 125 workers would die from construction accidents in the Greater Toronto Area from 1964 until the end of the 70s. Provincial work safety legislation would be improved multiple times throughout the 60s and 70s, introducing a robust set of rules, enforcement practices, and educational programs. This would lead to a significant reduction in work injuries and deaths. At every legislative step, Gallagher, Pike, Riley, and all of Local 183's large membership were vital contributors. During the first 10 months of 1974 alone, government safety inspections resulted in 321 convictions, 195 more than the previous year. By that point, the injury rate in the construction industry had dropped by 2% every year since 1971.
Well, it had to be a lot more than just shutting down jobs. So my father began to put on a business suit and lobby the government and seek change through the courts and by lobbying the Ontario government to bring in legislation. And through his efforts, I think one of the hospitals got a decompression chamber. In case a worker developed a Ben's disease, they could bring them there and properly, you know, almost like an astronaut coming from outer space. So they put them in an environment that was slowly changed back to the normal pressure. He came to know, sadly, the coroner's office because of the amount of workers that were dying, and recommendations that came out of the coroner's office were important to trigger change. So in that case, he became quite friendly and got to know Morton Shulman, who was very active at that time, and politically active too. He saw a kindred spirit in Morton Shulman, somebody who wanted to agitate for change and was willing to take risks and you know, do things a little bit out of the ordinary in order to make change happen. And so my dad was involved with you know, the coroner's inquest and making recommendations to bring in better, safer laws. Things than tunneling, like making sure that there was a person on top of the tunnel that's job was to make sure that the people that were in the tunnel were safe. They didn't even have that before. The legislation happened because there was, you know, there was too many workers that were frequently dying. They would use old shoring over and over again, for example, on bridges. You know, there was the bridge collapse in Ottawa that happened around the same time. So quite a lot of public pressure came to bear on the government to do something. So governments did what governments do. They established a commission. One of the changes that came out of that was, believe it or not, prior to that findings and legislative change, workers did not have the right to stop working if it was unsafe. It was only due to that commission's findings that workers in Ontario has the right to refuse unsafe work. And I would say that action alone, has saved countless lives.
By the mid-1960s, most of those lives were of Italian immigrants, who became the majority of construction workers in Metro Toronto's residential and industrial sectors, as well as in Local 183's expanding membership. Growing also were the complaints about the executive's favoritism toward Irish members when it came to assigning construction jobs and union officer roles. The mounting protests peaked in the spring of 1968 after Biagio Di Giovanni, an executive board member of Local 183, published an article in an Italian-Canadian newspaper denouncing what he believed was the union leadership's ongoing discrimination towards its 2,500 Italian members, who represented about 80% of the membership. An internal trial initially banned Di Giovanni from ever holding executive office again, but soon afterwards, the two sides made peace, and the Italian was reinstated on the board after publicly retracting his accusations. That, however, was not enough to ease the tensions among the different ethnic groups within Local 183, which engaged in what the press called a riot on April 19, 1968. That day, during a meeting where Di Giovanni was to be reinstated at the Labour Lyceum on Spadina Avenue, a reportedly 300 Italians and 200 Portuguese and Anglophone members of Local 183 battled each other. Chairs, ashtrays, and fists flew through the air and landed on so-called union brothers. The fight went on until 20 Metro policemen arrived at the scene and dispersed the crowd. At the end of the brawl, Gallagher told a reporter that it was a miracle that no one got killed. Things returned more or less to normal after another general meeting in May. But in the summer of 1969, the Italian majority decided it was time to have one of their own lead Local 183 and elected John Stefanini as business manager, replacing Gallagher, who became president. Stefanini had been hired by Gallagher in 1960 when he was 20 years old and only recently arrived from Italy. His role was to be Gallagher's interpreter with Toronto's growing Italian workforce. But the young newcomer quickly became a respected organizer and climbed up the union ranks until becoming its secretary-treasurer. Along the way, he signed possibly thousands of workers and educated himself about Canadian labor laws, history, and management practices. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Stefanini would build on Gallagher's foundations and turn Local 183 into the largest construction union local in North America. Equip it with a modern office and training facilities, streamline its management practices, and oversee the creation of a range of social programs for its members, including a pension plan, credit union, and dental clinic. Stefanini's business-like style differed significantly from Gallagher's activist approach. Throughout his career, Stefanini would be accused by many union members, including fellow Italians, of being too friendly towards employers, sometimes at the expense of the workers, a view that was shared by Gallagher.
I'm having difficulty with some of the people on the executive committee. They're doing that. They're management-oriented, some of our own paid people. They have the old-fashioned idea the boss must be right, or touch your cap, or take off your hat when you arrive, the thing, which we've gotten rid of. And they're dependent upon the lawyers to handle their affairs. And it's unpleasant. They pass it on to the lawyers and so on. Johnny has formed safety committees again, but he hasn't asked me to. John Stefanini is our business manager. He hasn't asked me to go on it as of yet, because he's afraid of what I will do. He's afraid, I don't mind. He's afraid that I'll stop the jobs. Unions have been sued for millions of dollars and so on. But I don't give a damn. I'm not oriented at all. To me, human life is the most precious, and I shouldn't have to say that. Everybody says that, but some people say it but don't practice it. Believe you me that they said to me, it's not the same, Gerry. You'll have to get back out there and take the lead on this thing again. But they were proud of this. They'd say 183 to a contractor, and by God, that contractor would move, because he stopped. Look at Queen's Park up here, a block away from it. How many members of Parliament have come down and find out what the root cause, what's the cause of all the problem with Cupie or with my problem? None of them that I know of. Maybe Cupie can tell you different, but not me.
I've never viewed it, at least the family's never viewed it as being that he was really pushed aside so much. As you know, he reached a point in his career. The union had gotten quite a bit larger, and you know, it was a changing of the guard was happening with respect to the union. A lot of the most difficult fights had already been won. The union was growing. It was in great shape. So perhaps it was time for the changing of the guard, and my dad remained. I mean, he remained in the lesser role that he was in. But to say that he was forced out would be an insult to the people that came after, and it would be an insult to him as well, because he was not a man easily pushed aside. My father passed away in September the 2nd, Labor Day in 1978. And he was buried turned at Clarkson Cemetery in Mississauga. And I remember the day as clear as it was yesterday. Even though I was 17, I was one of the pallbearers. One of the things that impressed me at that time was the amount of people that came to the funeral. And it was massive, really, like a head of state. And I remember in the lead cars looking back along Lakeshore, heading to the cemetery. And as far as the eye could see was cars following with their lights on. Like you couldn't see the end of the cars or the people that were coming. So it really gave me the impression at that time that my father was a great man. You know, that people loved him and that they came to say goodbye because they wanted to be there, not out of a sense of duty. And you know, when we spread out in the cemetery for the final vows, every inch of the cemetery was taken up by people standing. I was very young. I wish that he had not passed away in 1978, because since then, you know, I've gone on to have a family of my own. You know, I have he has grandchildren that he never met, never got to meet my wife, which is very sad. I often think of it that he could have probably lived longer, but he really did sacrifice himself to his career and to building the union. He put everything that he had into that union. In spite of the fact that he was very proud of being Irish, Southern Irish, Republican Irish, if you like, that he felt as far as the union went, that we should be colorblind. You know, when it came to people, and you know, he socialized with the members that he was organizing. They would go to a lot of the local pubs in downtown Yonge Street. He never was a person to stand up on a large podium and look down on people. He felt like he was one of them. And you know, in our house, even in the family, the word love was heard often. Well, he loved the members. And I think they loved him back. That's a fact.
Gerry Gallagher was an exceptional human being, because he always put the members of the local union first. If you were working in a tunnel and you had some issue, you could phone Gerry Gallagher at 2 o'clock in the morning. He would be in the job site by 3. He was a great man. He was a good negotiator. He was a great speaker, and he was a true leader.
Gerry Gallagher, he was a tough guy. At that time, when they started, you know, they came to the job. You call him at midnight, he came to the job site. You know, no question about.
Gerry Gallagher was one of the most active organizer. He would stop any job just to help us, at the risk of injunction or other penalty. And he was really concerned. And he was coming to our meeting and was really fire up the troops about fighting. He was a real good man. I liked him.
After his death by heart attack at the young age of 64, public eulogies for Gerry Gallagher poured in. The press remembered him as a nonconformist, a relentless activist, and an eloquent communicator who upset many powerful men who, in turn, invariably respected him as a formidable foe and genuinely principled leader. The Labor's International Local 183 honored its founder by naming their new building and later its Union Hall after him. Today, they are North America's largest construction local, with nearly 60,000 members, the vast majority of them Portuguese immigrants and their direct descendants, but also still many Italians, Irish, and other workers of various nationalities. While Gerry Gallagher and his Local 183 played a central role in improving the lives and working conditions of laborers in Ontario, they were not the only champions of immigrant construction workers to make a lasting impact in this industry. Charles Irvine, Bruno Zanini, Marino Topan, Frank Colantonio, George Petta, Angelo Burigana, and the thousands of plasterers, bricklayers, carpenters, and laborers that made up the Brandon Union Group in the early 60s can also claim much of that history for themselves, as we will learn in the next episode.